In the shadowed corridors of the Palazzo Vecchio, where power whispered through stone walls and ambition carved itself into the very marble, a young diplomat named Lorenzo found himself face to face with the most dangerous lesson of his career. The year was 1513, and Niccolò Machiavelli, recently fallen from grace and exiled from the political theater he had once commanded, was about to demonstrate a principle that would echo through centuries of human manipulation and desire. Lorenzo had sought out the disgraced former secretary of the Florentine Republic not out of pity, but out of necessity. His own position at court had become precarious, his influence waning like shadows at noon. The duke he served had grown indifferent to his counsel, and Lorenzo felt himself becoming invisible in the very halls where he had once held sway. "You speak of losing favor as if it were a terminal disease," Machiavelli observed, his withered hands tracing patterns on the rough wooden table of the tavern where they met. "But, tell me, Lorenzo, when did you last refuse your duke anything? When did you last make him wait for your wisdom or wonder at your whereabouts?" The question struck Lorenzo like a blade between the ribs. He realized, with growing unease, that he had made himself as common as the air the duke breathed, essential perhaps, but utterly taken for granted. Machiavelli's eyes gleamed with the particular satisfaction of a teacher about to reveal a profound truth. "Power, my young friend, is not sustained by constant presence but by strategic absence. Obsession is not born from availability but from scarcity. This is the doctrine that governs not just courts and kingdoms, but the very hearts of men and women." What followed was an education in the dark arts of human psychology, delivered by a master who had observed the rise and fall of princes, the shifting loyalties of republics, and the eternal dance between desire and denial that governed all human relationships. The architecture of absence. Machiavelli began his instruction by drawing upon his observations of Cesare Borgia, the Duke of Valentinois, whose very name had once struck terror and admiration in equal measure across the Italian peninsula. "Il Valentino understood something that escapes most men in power," Machiavelli explained, his voice carrying the weight of hard-won wisdom. "He knew that a prince who is always visible becomes furniture in his own palace. But a prince who appears and disappears like morning mist becomes a force of nature in the minds of his subjects." Lorenzo leaned forward, captivated despite himself by the old man's intensity. Around them, the tavern hummed with the conversations of merchants and artisans, but their corner seemed isolated in its own pocket of conspiracy and revelation. "Borgia would vanish from his capital for weeks at a time," Machiavelli continued. "His courtiers would spend their days speculating about his whereabouts, his intentions, his next move. In his absence, he became larger than life. Every shadow might conceal his return, every messenger might carry his will. His physical absence created a psychological presence more powerful than any throne room appearance could achieve. The principle," Machiavelli explained, worked on multiple levels of human consciousness. First, there was the simple matter of attention economics. The human mind, he observed, was not designed to maintain constant focus on any single element of its environment. Like the eye that stops seeing the nose that perpetually occupies the center of its vision, consciousness naturally filters out the constant and familiar. "When you are always present," Machiavelli said, "you become part of the landscape. You are seen without being observed, heard without being listened to. Your words carry no more weight than the tolling of church bells that mark each hour but stir no one from their daily routine." But absence, strategic and calculated, created cognitive disruption. The mind, evolved to detect change and novelty as potential threats or opportunities, suddenly focused with laser intensity on what was missing. The absent person became a puzzle to be solved, a gap to be filled, an itch that demanded scratching. Lorenzo found himself thinking of Isabella, a lady of the court whom he had been pursuing with the ardent consistency of a monk at prayer. His daily gifts, his constant attendance at her side during social functions, his immediate responses to her every summons, all of it, he now realized, had made him as predictable and dismissible as sunrise. "You see the recognition in your eyes," Machiavelli noted with satisfaction. "Good. The heart follows the same laws as the state. Availability breeds contempt not because men and women are inherently cruel, but because the human psyche is wired to pursue what retreats and grow bored with what pursues. The psychological mechanism," Machiavelli explained, was rooted in the very structure of desire itself. Desire was not simply wanting something, it was wanting something that was not immediately obtainable. The moment an object of desire became fully available, fully possessed, fully understood, it ceased to be desirable and became merely owned. Consider the merchant who prizes most highly the spice that arrives rarely from distant lands, Machiavelli said. He will pay a fortune for saffron that comes once a year from the mountains of Persia, while ignoring the equally flavorful herbs that grow outside his door. The rarity transforms the substance, makes it precious in a way that has nothing to do with its inherent qualities. This principle, Machiavelli argued, was not merely a quirk of human psychology but a fundamental law of value creation. Scarcity didn't just make things more valuable, it made them more desired. And desire, properly cultivated and directed, was the most powerful force in human affairs. The old diplomat reached into his worn leather satchel and withdrew a small, leather-bound notebook filled with his cramped handwriting. "I have spent years observing the mechanics of power," he said, "and I have come to understand that all influence flows from a single source, the ability to control access to oneself." He opened the notebook and showed Lorenzo page after page of observations, each entry documenting how various princes, merchants, courtesans, and even religious figures had wielded absence as a tool of influence. There was the Venetian merchant who made fortunes by announcing his goods would be available for only 3 days before moving to the next city. There was the courtesan who drove men to madness by being unavailable more often than not, making each encounter feel like a rare privilege. There was the cardinal who spoke so rarely that when he did open his mouth, princes and paupers alike hung on his every word. Each of them understood intuitively what philosophers struggle to articulate, Machiavelli said. Human attention is not unlimited, and human desire is not constant. Both must be carefully managed, rationed, and deployed for maximum effect. Lorenzo felt a chill of recognition as he began to understand the scope of what Machiavelli was describing. This was not simply a tactic for court intrigue or romantic pursuit, it was a comprehensive theory of human influence that touched every aspect of social interaction. But, surely, Lorenzo protested, there must be limits to this principle. A prince who is never present cannot rule effectively. A merchant who never shows his wares cannot conduct business. A lover who is never available cannot maintain a relationship. Machiavelli smiled, the expression sharp as a blade's edge. Now you begin to grasp the true complexity of the doctrine. Yes, there are limits, and the art lies in finding the precise balance between presence and absence, availability and scarcity. Too much absence and you become irrelevant, too much presence and you become invisible. The master of influence learns to dance on this knife's edge, appearing just often enough to maintain relevance while remaining absent just enough to maintain mystery. The conversation continued deep into the night, with Machiavelli painting increasingly complex pictures of how the scarcity doctrine could be applied across different contexts and relationships. He spoke of timing, how absence was most powerful when it came unexpectedly, just as someone had grown accustomed to constant availability. He discussed intensity, how the quality of presence during brief appearances could amplify the impact of subsequent absence. He explored the psychology of uncertainty, how not knowing when someone would next appear created a state of hypervigilance that could be more exhausting than actual presence. As the candles burned lower and the tavern gradually emptied, Lorenzo found himself seeing his entire social world through new eyes. Every relationship, every power dynamic, every exchange of influence suddenly revealed itself as a complex dance of presence and absence, availability and scarcity. The duke who ignores your counsel, Machiavelli observed, does so not because your advice lacks merit, but because you have made it too easily obtained. Your wisdom has become common currency, and common currency, by definition, lacks value. Lorenzo nodded slowly, already beginning to formulate how he might apply these insights to his own circumstances. But Machiavelli held up a warning hand. Beware, my young friend, of thinking this is merely a collection of tricks to be deployed without thought or conscience. The doctrine of scarcity is a double-edged sword that can cut its wielder as easily as its target. Use it poorly, and you will find yourself not mysterious but merely absent, not scarce but simply forgotten. The mechanics of strategic withdrawal. The second phase of Lorenzo's education began 3 days later, when he arrived at their agreed meeting place to find only an empty table and a brief note, "Absence teaches presence. Apply what you have learned. N.M." Lorenzo felt a flash of irritation, then a grudging admiration as he realized Machiavelli was demonstrating his own principles. The old fox was making Lorenzo experience firsthand the psychological impact of unexpected unavailability. For 2 weeks, Lorenzo heard nothing from his instructor. But the seeds Machiavelli had planted continued to grow in his mind, and Lorenzo began to experiment cautiously with the principles he had learned. Instead of immediately responding to every summons from the Duke, he began to delay, sometimes by hours, sometimes by a full day. He stopped hovering at the edges of court gatherings, instead arriving late and departing early. Most significantly, he ceased his daily visits to Isabella, replacing constant attention with sporadic, intense encounters. The results were immediate and dramatic. The Duke, accustomed to Lorenzo's instant availability, began to ask others about his whereabouts when he was not immediately at hand. Isabella, who had grown used to dismissing his attentions, began to seek him out when he failed to appear at social functions. Even the other courtiers began to regard him with new curiosity, wondering what important business kept him so mysteriously occupied. When Machiavelli finally reappeared, Lorenzo was ready with a dozen questions about the subtle mechanics of strategic withdrawal. They met again in the same tavern, but this time Lorenzo noticed how differently he felt about the encounter. The anticipation had made it precious in a way their first meeting had not been. "You begin to understand," Machiavelli said, noting Lorenzo's eager attention. "But understanding the principle is only the beginning. The true art lies in execution, in knowing precisely when to withdraw, for how long, and how to return." Machiavelli explained that strategic absence was not simply a matter of disappearing randomly or arbitrarily. Like a master musician who knows that the power of a note lies not just in its sound but in the silence that precedes and follows it, the practitioner of scarcity doctrine had to understand the rhythm and timing that would maximize psychological impact. "Consider the courtesan I mentioned," Machiavelli said. She did not simply vanish for weeks at a time. She studied her patrons, learned their patterns of desire, and withdrew at the precise moment when their interest was at its peak. She reappeared just as their frustration reached the point of seeking alternatives elsewhere. Too early, and the absence would not create sufficient longing. Too late, and they would have moved on to other pursuits. The timing of withdrawal, Machiavelli explained, was crucial. The most powerful absences came just as the target was becoming comfortable with constant availability. When someone had grown accustomed to immediate access, sudden unavailability created a jarring cognitive dissonance that demanded resolution. "Think of it as creating a hunger," he said. "A man who has grown accustomed to feasting will barely notice if his plate is full, but he will become obsessed with food the moment his plate is empty." The same principle applies to attention, affection, and influence. But timing was only one element of effective strategic withdrawal. Equally important was the manner of absence. Machiavelli distinguished between different types of unavailability, each designed to create specific psychological effects. There was mysterious absence, disappearing without explanation, leaving others to wonder and speculate about one's activities. This type of withdrawal sparked curiosity and imagination, allowing others to fill the vacuum of information with their own projections and fantasies. There was busy absence, being unavailable due to important but unspecified obligations. This created the impression of being in high demand, suggesting that one's time and attention were valuable commodities competed for by others. There was selective absence, being unavailable to some while remaining accessible to others. This created hierarchies of access that made availability feel like a privilege rather than a right. And there was complete absence, total withdrawal from a social system or relationship. This was the nuclear option of scarcity doctrine, creating either intense longing or complete dismissal depending on how it was executed. Each type of absence, Machiavelli explained, creates different emotional and psychological responses. The art lies in matching the type of withdrawal to your specific objectives and to the psychology of your target. Lorenzo found himself taking mental notes as Machiavelli described case studies from his years of diplomatic observation. There was the French ambassador who made himself indispensable to the papal court by being available for consultation only 2 days per week, making those sessions intensely valuable to all participants. There was the Milanese banker who increased demand for his loans by announcing he would consider only a limited number of new clients each month. There was the Florentine artist who commanded higher prices by accepting only one commission at a time and maintaining a waiting list of potential patrons. In each case, artificial scarcity had transformed perception of value. The same services that might have been taken for granted when freely available became precious when access was limited and uncertain.
But, how does one implement such strategies without appearing manipulative or calculating? Lorenzo asked, voicing the concern that had been growing in his mind as he experimented with these techniques. Machiavelli's laugh was sharp and knowing. Manipulation, my dear Lorenzo, is simply influence that serves interests other than our own. When we call someone manipulative, we are really saying they are better at getting what they want than we are at getting what we want.
The old diplomat leaned forward, his voice taking on the intensity Lorenzo had come to associate with his most important insights.
The question is not whether to influence others, we influence others simply by existing in their world.
The question is whether to do so consciously and skillfully, or unconsciously and clumsily. Strategic absence, Machiavelli argued, was actually more honest than many forms of social interaction. Rather than pretending to feel constant enthusiasm for everyone's company, it acknowledged the natural rhythms of human attention and desire. Rather than creating false scarcity through deception, it created real scarcity through discipline and choice.
The merchant who limits his inventory to create artificial shortage is deceiving his customers, Machiavelli said.
But, the man who limits his availability because he genuinely has other valuable pursuits is simply being honest about the finite nature of time and attention. The key, he explained, was ensuring that one's absences were backed by genuine value and activity. The most effective practitioners of scarcity doctrine were not simply playing games of hide and seek, they were actually engaged in valuable pursuits that legitimately limited their availability. If you withdraw from court to read philosophy, study military strategy, or develop new skills, your absence serves a dual purpose, Machiavelli explained. It creates scarcity that enhances your perceived value, and it actually increases your real value through self-improvement.
This is why the doctrine is so powerful. When properly applied, it aligns psychological manipulation with genuine personal development.
Lorenzo began to see how he might restructure his entire approach to court life. Instead of hovering hopefully at the edges of power, he could withdraw strategically to pursue genuine learning and skill development. His absences would be real and purposeful, not merely theatrical, and would serve to actually increase his worth while simultaneously increasing others' perception of his worth. But Machiavelli was not finished with his instruction.
There is another element to consider, he said, and that is the art of the return. How one reappears after absence is as important as how one withdraws.
The return from absence, Machiavelli explained, had to be carefully calibrated to maximize its impact.
Return too soon or too eagerly, and the effect of absence would be undermined.
Return with too little fanfare, and the absence might seem merely accidental rather than intentional. Return too dramatically, and the calculation behind the absence would become transparent and lose its power. The ideal return, he said, should feel both inevitable and special. Those who have missed your presence should feel that your reappearance is a natural consequence of their longing, while simultaneously feeling privileged to have regained access to you.
Machiavelli described various techniques for effective reappearance.
There was the soft return, gradually increasing one's presence and availability over time, like dawn slowly brightening the sky. There was the dramatic return, reappearing suddenly, and, memorably, like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. There was the conditional return, making one's renewed availability dependent on certain conditions being met, thereby maintaining an element of scarcity even within presence. The choice of return strategy, he explained, should depend on your objectives, your relationship with those from whom you have withdrawn, and the length and nature of your absence. As their second long evening of instruction drew to a close, Lorenzo felt he was beginning to grasp not just the tactics but the deeper philosophy behind Machiavelli's scarcity doctrine. It was not simply about manipulating others' perceptions, but about fundamentally restructuring one's relationship to power, influence, and social interaction.
You speak of this as if it were an art form, Lorenzo observed.
Because it is, Machiavelli replied. The finest art conceals its technique while producing effects that seem natural and inevitable. The master of strategic absence makes his withdrawals and returns seem like the natural rhythm of an interesting and valuable life, not the calculated moves of a social chess player.
This, Lorenzo realized, was what separated Machiavelli's doctrine from crude manipulation or game playing. When properly executed, strategic absence didn't feel manipulative to its targets because it was grounded in genuine value and authentic choice.
The scarcity was real-time and attention truly were limited resources, and the withdrawal truly was in service of valuable activities and personal development. The philosophy of psychological scarcity. Another week passed before Lorenzo's final lesson, and this time he was not surprised by Machiavelli's initial absence. When the old diplomat finally appeared, Lorenzo had already begun to experience a deeper understanding of the psychological dynamics they had been exploring. "You are learning to live with uncertainty," Machiavelli observed approvingly. "That is perhaps the most important skill for anyone who would wield influence in an uncertain world." Their final meeting took place not in the tavern but in a small garden behind a monastery, where ancient olive trees created patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift and dance with each breeze. The setting felt appropriate for what Lorenzo sensed would be a more philosophical discussion. "We have spoken of techniques and tactics," Machiavelli began, "but the true power of the scarcity doctrine lies deeper than mere strategic behavior. It rests on fundamental truths about human nature and the architecture of desire itself. The first of these truths," Machiavelli explained, "was that human beings were fundamentally creatures of pursuit rather than possession. The joy of the hunt exceeded the satisfaction of the catch. The anticipation of pleasure surpassed the experience of pleasure itself. This was not a flaw in human design but an adaptive feature that had enabled survival and progress throughout history. If our ancestors had been content with what they possessed, they would never have explored new territories, developed new technologies, or built new civilizations," Machiavelli said. "The restless dissatisfaction that makes possession less satisfying than pursuit is the engine of all human achievement." Understanding this principle allowed one to work with human nature rather than against it. Instead of trying to satisfy others completely, an impossible task that led only to their eventual boredom and departure, one could maintain their engagement by ensuring that complete satisfaction remained always just beyond reach. This is why the greatest seducers, the most effective leaders, and the most influential teachers all intuitively understand the power of withholding, Machiavelli explained. They give enough to maintain interest and hope, but never so much as to eliminate desire. The second fundamental truth was that value was not intrinsic but contextual. The same object, service, or relationship could be precious or worthless depending entirely on its availability and the circumstances surrounding it. Water was worthless in a flowing river but priceless in a desert. Attention was dismissed when freely given but treasured when sparingly offered. Affection was taken for granted when constant but desperately sought when withdrawn. This means, Machiavelli said, that anyone who understands the principles of scarcity can literally create value from nothing more than strategic limitation of access. He told Lorenzo about a Venetian merchant who had transformed his middling silk business into a luxury brand simply by refusing to sell to more than 50 customers per year. The silk was the same quality as his competitors, but, by making it artificially scarce, he had transformed it into a status symbol that commanded prices 10 times higher than similar products. The third truth was that human psychology was fundamentally social and competitive. People wanted not just things, but things that others could not have. They desired not just access, but privileged access. They sought not just attention, but exclusive attention. This competitive element of human desire means that scarcity has a multiplying effect, Machiavelli explained. When others know that access to you is limited, they not only want that access for themselves, they want to deny it to their rivals. Your scarcity becomes a tool in their own social competition. Lorenzo began to understand why Isabella had become so much more interested in his company once he had stopped being constantly available. It was not simply that absence had made him more intriguing, it was that his unavailability had made her access to him feel like a victory over other potential competitors for his attention. The fourth truth was that uncertainty created stronger emotional bonds than certainty. Psychologists would later call this the principle of intermittent reinforcement, but Machiavelli understood it intuitively through his observations of human behavior in political and social contexts. A subject who always receives rewards from his prince will become complacent, Machiavelli said. A subject who never receives rewards will become discouraged and look elsewhere for advancement. But a subject who receives rewards occasionally and unpredictably will become intensely loyal, always hoping that the next reward is just around the corner. This principle explained why strategic absence was more powerful than either constant presence or complete absence. Intermittent availability created a psychological state similar to gambling addiction, where the unpredictable nature of the reward made the pursuit more compelling than any predictable pattern could achieve. Lorenzo found himself thinking about his own relationship patterns and realizing how many of his past mistakes could be understood through this lens. His constant availability had created certainty, which had bred contempt. His predictable behavior had eliminated the excitement of uncertainty that kept attraction alive. But, surely, Lorenzo said, this creates a rather cynical view of human relationships. If we are all just manipulating each other's psychology for advantage, what becomes of genuine affection, loyalty, and love? Machiavelli considered this question carefully before responding. I think you mistake understanding for cynicism, he said finally. A physician's knowledge of anatomy does not make him hate the human body, it makes him better able to heal it. Similarly, understanding the mechanics of desire and influence does not make relationships impossible, it makes them more skillful and, ultimately, more satisfying for all involved. He went on to explain that the scarcity doctrine, properly applied, actually served the interests of both parties in any relationship. By maintaining some element of mystery and unavailability, one prevented the relationship from falling into the trap of taking each other for granted. By creating space for longing and anticipation, one kept the relationship vital and engaging rather than allowing it to decay into habit and routine. The alternative to conscious application of these principles is not pure, untainted love, Machiavelli said. The alternative is unconscious application, where relationships deteriorate through neglect of these fundamental psychological truths. He described couples he had observed where one partner had made themselves completely available and predictable while the other had maintained some independence and unpredictability. Without exception, he claimed, the available partner had gradually lost influence and attraction while the scarce partner had retained both. Understanding these dynamics allows both parties to maintain balance, he explained. Both can maintain some degree of scarcity and mystery, creating a relationship where both partners continue to pursue and be pursued, rather than one pursuing and one being pursued. The same principle applied to all forms of influence and leadership. The most effective leaders were those who maintained some distance and unpredictability while still being present enough to guide and inspire. They gave their followers enough access to feel valued, but not so much access that they were taken for granted. The prince who eats with his soldiers becomes one of them and loses his authority, Machiavelli observed. But the prince who never appears before his soldiers becomes a distant abstraction and loses their loyalty. The art lies in finding the balance that maintains both respect and connection. As their final conversation continued into the evening hours, Lorenzo began to understand that what Machiavelli was describing was not just a collection of tactics for gaining advantage over others, but a comprehensive philosophy for living effectively in a social world governed by psychological laws as immutable as physical ones. Gravity exists whether we understand it or not, Machiavelli said. But understanding it allows us to build bridges and cathedrals that would be impossible without that knowledge. Similarly, the psychological principles of scarcity and desire exist whether we acknowledge them or not. But understanding them allows us to build relationships and influence structures that would be impossible without that knowledge. The doctrine of strategic absence was not about deceiving others or manipulating them against their interests. It was about working skillfully within the natural patterns of human psychology to create outcomes that served everyone involved. By maintaining appropriate scarcity, one prevented relationships from deteriorating into contempt and boredom. By creating space for longing and anticipation, one kept interactions vital and meaningful. The greatest tragedy I have observed in courts and in bedchambers alike, Machiavelli said, is not the failure of love, but the destruction of love through ignorance of these principles. How many marriages have withered because partners made themselves too available? How many promising political alliances have crumbled because allies took each other for granted? How many brilliant minds have been dismissed because they shared their insights too freely? Lorenzo realized that what Machiavelli was offering was not just a tool for gaining power over others, but a framework for preventing the slow decay that seemed to affect so many human relationships and social structures. By understanding and respecting the psychological need for scarcity, mystery, and pursuit, one could maintain the vitality that made relationships rewarding for all involved. As the evening drew to a close and the monastery bells tolled the hour, Lorenzo felt he had received not just instruction in political tactics but initiation into a deeper understanding of human nature itself. The scarcity doctrine was revealed not as a manipulation technique but as a fundamental principle for navigating the complex psychology of desire, influence, and social connection. Remember, Machiavelli said as they prepared to part, the goal is not to make others obsessed with you for your own gratification. The goal is to understand the natural rhythms of human attention and desire so that you can work with them rather than against them. Master these principles, and you will find that your relationships become more satisfying, your influence more sustainable, and your life more interesting.
Lorenzo walked away from that final meeting with his mind spinning with possibilities and insights. He had arrived seeking simple tactics for regaining favor at court, but he was leaving with a comprehensive philosophy for understanding and working with the deepest currents of human psychology. In the weeks that followed, Lorenzo applied what he had learned with careful attention to both technique and principle. He withdrew strategically from court life to study military history and classical rhetoric. He made himself available to the Duke only at specified times, making those consultations more valuable through their scarcity. He transformed his pursuit of Isabella from constant availability to intermittent, intense encounters that left her anticipating their next meeting. The results exceeded even his expectations. The Duke began to value his counsel more highly, often seeking him out specifically because of his reputation for being difficult to find. Isabella found herself thinking about him during his absences and eagerly looking forward to their encounters. Even the other courtiers began to regard him as someone whose time and attention were precious commodities. But, more importantly, Lorenzo discovered that his own life had become more interesting and fulfilling. By creating genuine scarcity through meaningful activities, he had forced himself to develop new skills and knowledge. By maintaining some mystery and unpredictability, he had prevented his relationships from falling into boring routine. By understanding the principles governing human desire and attention, he had gained the ability to navigate social situations with skill and confidence. Years later, when Lorenzo had himself become an influential figure at court, he would look back on those conversations with Machiavelli as the turning point in his understanding of power, influence, and human nature. The old diplomat had given him more than tactics, he had provided a lens through which to see and work with the fundamental forces that governed all human interaction. The doctrine of strategic absence had revealed itself not as a cynical manipulation technique but as a profound insight into the psychology of desire and the architecture of influence. By understanding that scarcity created value, that mystery maintained interest, and that pursuit was more satisfying than possession, one could create relationships and social structures that remained vital and engaging over time. In a world where most people exhausted themselves through constant availability and predictable behavior, those who understood the power of strategic absence could achieve remarkable influence while actually investing less effort. By working with human nature rather than against it, they could create the very obsession and attention they sought while maintaining their own autonomy and developing their own capabilities. The wisdom Machiavelli had shared in those shadowed conversations would echo through centuries of human interaction, influencing everyone from political leaders to artists, from business innovators to lovers. The principle that absence could trigger obsession, properly understood and applied, would prove to be one of the most powerful tools for anyone seeking to understand and influence the complex psychology of desire that drives all human behavior. In the end, Lorenzo realized Machiavelli had taught him something more valuable than any specific technique or tactic. He had shown him how to see the invisible forces that shaped human interaction, and, more importantly, how to work skillfully with those forces rather than being unconsciously manipulated by them. The scarcity doctrine was not just about making others want what you could offer, it was about understanding the fundamental dynamics of value, desire, and influence that governed all social interaction. This understanding would serve Lorenzo well throughout his career, allowing him to build lasting influence not through constant effort and availability, but through strategic application of presence and absence, scarcity and abundance, mystery and revelation. He had learned to dance with the natural rhythms of human psychology, creating outcomes that served not just his own interests but the interests of everyone involved in his expanding network of relationships and influence. The conversations with Machiavelli had lasted only a few weeks, but their impact would shape Lorenzo's approach to power and relationships for the rest of his life. He had discovered that true mastery lay not in forcing others to pay attention, but in creating conditions where attention arose naturally and sustainably.
By understanding the doctrine of scarcity, he had gained access to one of the most powerful forces in human psychology, the eternal tension between desire and possession that drives all human striving and achievement.